Welcome to this Pixotope tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to use the performance debugging tools in Pixotope. Pixotope is based on Unreal Engine, and performance costs in Unreal Engine can be very contextual. Whether an asset is too heavy for your scene greatly depends on the tools and features you are using. Like everything else in Unreal, most Pixotope features also have a performance cost. A scene that runs well in native Unreal might not always run well in Pixotope, depending on the features and composition of the scene. Lumen global illumination and reflections can allow your scene to look great and be fully dynamic, but can come with some high costs for shadows and lights. Since lights and shadows interact with almost every element of your scene, the complexity in determining which assets or settings need to be optimized can be a daunting task. Before attempting this task, we recommend that you read through our hardware and software environment guide, which can be found in the Pixotope Help Center. Lights can be a very common source of performance issues. It is not necessarily the lights themselves, but all the features and settings that determine what happens with the light and the objects affected by it. When using Lumen, all lights are treated as movable and are as a consequence much more expensive than a static or baked light. When using movable lights, it is therefore important to limit the area which the light affects. Unreal and Pixotope have a useful tool in this regard, the Light Complexity View Mode. You can switch to this view mode by pressing the Views button near the top left corner of your viewport, going to Optimization View Modes, and selecting Light Complexity. The gradient at the bottom of the viewport tells us what the different colors mean. If all these lights are dynamic, areas that are colored white or even red in this view can be very expensive. If using only static lights, this view mode will not be very useful to you since all the lights are pre-computed before playing the scene, and therefore have very low performance impact. However, a view mode that can be useful when using static lighting is the light map density. This will only be accessible when Allow Static Lighting is enabled in your project settings. This view mode visualizes the resolution of your light map textures. The squares on the surfaces represent the resolution of the light maps. We can see what happens if we increase the light map resolution of our floor. High-resolution light maps can quickly consume your machine's video memory, so it's wise to avoid using excessively high resolutions. When it comes to the geometry itself, there are also view modes to visualize the complexity. One of these is the Quad Overdraw. This shows you the density of geometry that is drawn, and it also accounts for translucent objects. This is useful because translucent objects can significantly increase the rendering cost of your scene, as both the translucent geometry and the objects behind it need to be rendered. For this reason, to optimize performance, try to avoid having too many overlapping translucent objects. The Shader Complexity View mode is also useful in this regard, but it visualizes the complexity of your materials rather than the complexity of the geometry. View modes are not the only way to visualize performance costs. In the Pixotope Utilities panel, you can find shortcuts to useful console commands like stat detailed. This command adds a screen overlay that displays details about the duration of processes in the engine for each frame. Another useful shortcut is the GPU profiler. This can point you towards the parts of the scene that are heaviest for the GPU to render each frame. You can expand segments to break them down until you find the individual actors or features that might be causing the GPU load to be too high. Before using these visualizations, it can be a good idea to have a look at the Health panel in Pixotope Director. This panel shows you information about CPU and GPU utilization, as well as memory usage and temperatures. Finally, let's run through some general tips for your scenes. Any object that is never going to be in front of your camera input can have Render Custom Depth Pass disabled. This can save some performance, since the cost of rendering in custom depth passes can get high if you have a large amount of objects with this setting enabled. Another tip is that you should consider what is the most optimal reflection method for your scene. The most performant is to set the reflection method to none in your post-process handler and use reflection capture actors. But this method does not allow for dynamic reflections. Another option is to use planar reflections. These can look great, but can be expensive since they are essentially rendering your scene twice. Yet another option is to use lumen reflections. In this case, you should also enable lumen global illumination. Lumen comes with quite a high upfront performance cost, and in addition to that, it will treat all lights in your scene as movable. Lumen will typically be very expensive if your scene has a lot of lights. Our third tip is that loading textures and meshes at runtime can quite easily stall the engine, causing frame drops. You can get around this by preloading those assets before you go live. This includes things like spawning the objects you need, making variables to store textures if you'll be switching out a texture in a material during runtime, and pre-passing any files you may need to read. Our fourth and final tip is that in the current version of Unreal and Pixotope, 3D models with masked materials, especially those that are animated or are in motion, can become very costly to render. This is particularly common with foliage, where leaves or branches often use masked materials. In many cases, it may actually be more performance efficient to model the geometry instead of relying on an alpha mask. For more information on this or any other Pixotope subject, make sure to visit the Pixotope Help Center, link in the description.